Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a wonderful break. Hope it was as relaxing and enjoyable as possible. Today we're going to continue with the unit on ethics as an area of knowledge. And we started with an overview introducing the three different areas of study that we look at in ethics. And we're moving past the definitions of ethics. We're going to look at a more specific branch of ethical study called metaethics today. So metaethics literally translates to above ethics. The prefix meta comes from the Greek word meaning above. So like metaphysical means stuff that transcends the physical world in philosophy. And in this case, we're thinking about not necessarily right and wrong decisions, but what comes above those, or what even, what are the foundations of those ethical decisions? How do we actually arrive at ethical truth? So let's start with a question, as I always like to do. Do you think that an action is right or wrong, regardless of the person who commits the action? So, for example, if there is a traumatized person, do you think there's a moral difference if a person with a past experience of trauma actually commits a crime as compared to a person who's had a relatively easy life, or a non traumatized person? Or should we evaluate actions in a vacuum? Are actions right or wrong, regardless of who does them? Can you think of an instance that might make this question a little bit more interesting or complicated? Do we make preferences in the criminal justice system for mentally disabled people when they commit crimes? Um, is that a fair comparison? Are there other kinds of circumstances that would actually change how you calculate the rightness and wrongness of actions? Or do you think actions are just right and wrong regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the person doing them? So this might speak a lot to your personality and how you view ethics generally, but how did you get there? Why do you have the view that you do on this question? That's what metaethics is really concerned with. So, like I said, the prefix meta means above ethics. We're asking, what is the nature of ethical knowledge? Can there be an identifiable nature of ethical knowledge? And so we're going to get into the two most basic approaches, this kind of absolutism world where, yes, morals are real and true and there can be universal standards, and the more relativistic world where morality is nothing objectively universal, but it is relative to the culture that you came up in and relative to the individual. So let's take a look at one side of this equation, and that would be the arguments behind moral realism. Moral realism would hold that it is possible to have real and objective moral principles, and there are a few different kinds of versions of this. So there's a subset of moral realism called ethical intuitionism, which argues that much like we have physical senses, we seem to be born with a kind of moral sense, that even very, very young children who haven't learned lessons of right and wrong kind of demonstrate a sense that they know when they've done something wrong, or that they know when something is wrong and they're testing to see if they can get away with it. There are other arguments about this as well. Another version might be called ethical naturalism. And in this kind of argument, you would assume that moral values are actually part of our biology. They're part of the nature of humans. They're part of our reducible physical properties, that there are evolutionary essences of humanity, and we are geared towards perceiving the world in certain ways, and we are geared towards behaving in certain ways that are conditioned by evolution so as to survive and get along in society. And these are all kind of versions of an argument of ethical naturalism. There are also religious versions of this, saying that that we were imbued with some kind of moral nature as part of divine creation. Then also there's the question of moral reasoning. And this would get us into an argument called ethical cognitivism. Ethical cognitivists would hold that moral reasoning is possible, that it is possible to have a moral judgment that is rationally true or rationally false. And we're going to see that there's an opposite side of this, that people say that there is that the idea of rationalizing your morality is actually more of an illusion. Those would be called the non-cognitivists, that we really respond to things with our gut feelings. We respond to moral situations and moral judgments with our gut feelings, that we don't actually think it through. Reasoning is just kind of a facade. We've already made our choice. We're just going through the process that we think we're supposed to go through. And this would lead generally to a possible argument, not necessarily always. Realist doesn't have to be an absolutist. But most of the time, moral realists tend to lean towards moral absolutism. And this is the argument that moral principles can be universal, can be universally applied. Some societies, basically, societies share some very, very basic cultural notions of morality universally. And in almost all cultures, pretty much all cultures have some version of the golden rule and have some notion of sacrifice necessary to live in a community. So you might argue that some things are just morally absolutely wrong, regardless of circumstance, culture, etc. Now, the strength of this viewpoint is that universal principles like human rights are only possible in an absolutist world. Most societies and individuals agree that certain actions like murder and rape are always wrong. Although there are situations where you might be surprised where these things have been justified. The weakness of moral absolutism, of course, is that it can lead to closed-mindedness, and potentially intolerance. So most extremists can find their extremism through a sense of moral absolutism. Some things are always right, always wrong. I can't understand how somebody could possibly do this regardless of their motivation, their intentions, their cultural background, their traumatic experiences. And that might lead to a more violent, punitive kind of attitude towards people that you perceive to be wrongdoers, or the infidels, or the evildoers, or whatever they've been called, however the enemies have been portrayed. That's one of the dangers of moral absolutism. But I think all of us probably at least believe in this to some extent, and we kind of balance it out with the other side a little bit. I think most people dabble in a little bit of both sides of this. So the opposing perspective would be called moral non-realism. And this would argue and assume that there are no objective moral values. Now, this can take a lot of forms. Ethical non-cognitivism would say that moral judgments really don't have any truth value. They're very skeptical of our ability to actually arrive at universal moral truth. And you might even get a version of this. The most popular version is by a British philosopher named A.J. Ayer, called ethical emotivism, that moral judgments are just expressions of gut feelings, of emotions. Goodness is not some kind of scientific or objective property. You can't quantify it, you can't measure it. So if I say stealing is wrong, all I've really said is that stealing exists. There's nothing measurable that I could prove scientifically about rightness and wrongness. And Ayer would also say that most of our moral debates really just come down to gut feelings. Interestingly enough, there is neuroscientific evidence of this, that if you give someone a moral dilemma and you scan their brain under fMRI, in some experiments, based on the brain activity, researchers could predict a person's answer 12 minutes in some cases before they actually made their decision and answered. Because reading the brain waves will strongly indicate that the person has made their mind up and they're just kind of going through a process of rationalizing it. That would be support for ethical emotivism, that our brains actually kind of decide and then figure out how to rationalize it afterward. So we're really just trying to justify our gut feelings. So that's ethical emotivism. Now, this might lead us down to a pathway of moral relativism or subjectivism, which means that all ethics would be relative to the culture, to the individual, etc. No such thing as universal morality actually exists. Now, the strength of this is that it can be very tolerant. There's a lot of cultural sensitivity when we try to be relativist. The issue is that it's kind of self-defeating. Relativism itself is relative. According to its own premise, relativism cannot be absolutely true. So maybe in some instances, is there room for absolutism? It seems like a kind of paradoxical claim. In addition, it seems that, like we said before, almost all societies hold some basic moral principles. Although, actually, let me go back to this. One thing I would say is that in a military context, in a war and emergency context, as we're seeing, some of the things that we might think are universally true morally might come into question. And so when we've seen rape be taught as a strategy, it's been as a military strategy. When we've seen it be used and advocated, it's been as a strategy for power and control, control of populations, control of rebellion. And sadly, not just other countries and dictatorships have engaged in this, but the United States, especially during the Cold War, and you can look this up, it's called the School of the Americas. We had military training facilities where we trained these Latin American dictators and taught them to go out and rape people. So that's the one instance where I could find where people actually advocate rape as a moral good. It's good to control the population, to bring stability to a region by making the people afraid and preventing rebellion. Other than that, I think most of the time we would say universally rape is bad, but you can maybe foresee some instance where there could be exceptions for things like even rape, murder, and theft. Is it relative to the situation? We'll go into some more specific ways of trying to resolve these when we get into normative ethics. But of course, I think the key question here is, are you a relativist or an absolutist? Do you believe in moral realism or non-realism? And of course, for TOK, the big ethical question is, why? So let's take a couple of tests. I usually have students that are kind of offended by the idea of animal sacrifice, this kind of ritualistic sacrifice for an animal for some spiritual purpose. But, could you tell a religious person that their animal sacrifice is wrong? Most students are horrified by the idea of female circumcision, which, if you don't know about it, it can be a pretty horrifying thing to research. In countries like Ethiopia and Somalia and Eritrea and a few of these kind of Eastern African countries, it's very common for women in a coming of age ceremony to have their clitoris cut or their vaginal canal actually sewn shut in some instances. There are a few different kinds of procedures that they do. Some of them are pretty gruesome, but they actually will damage the woman's genitals in a lot of instances. And most Westerners think this is horrifying. But last year, actually, this Kenyan physician, this female doctor, published a paper that was very controversial defending the practice, saying that it was done by choice in most instances and that it's a tradition that is seen as empowerment for women, making women stronger, and that it shouldn't just be universally demonized as it is in the Western world. Another interesting relativism test is, we look at like Islam versus the United States and definitions of feminism. I've heard Muslim women argue that the American freedom actually is quite a prison for a lot of women because they have to go out and compete for mates, they have to go out and compete for wealth, whereas in a more patriarchal controlled system, a woman is covered. She doesn't have to be judged by her looks, not nearly as much as in Western society. Arranged marriages give women a lot more freedom in not having to go out and compete and get into sniping each other for men. And that some of these systems of patriarchy actually cradle the woman so that she has other kinds of freedom. And I've heard it come back to like, oh yeah, sure, slaves too also had tons of freedom. They didn't have to worry about paying bills or anything. So there are a lot of ways, perspectives that you could see some moral problems that may seem pretty obvious. And then, of course, one interesting area is the notion of historical relativism. Very often we look back at figures in history and judge them morally. Those racists, they all owned slaves, those terrible people. But of course, in history, morals were very different. They change over time. One of the examples I like to bring up is from ancient Greece. There was very much a celebration, although it was controversial. There were people who dissented. But there was a celebration of the romantic culture of pederasty in ancient Greece. And this was actually when the romantic love was actually seen in its highest form by many Greek elites as between an older man and a teenage boy. Was this morally wrong? There were some dissents, like I said, in one of the Platonic dialogues, you see some dissent against this and criticism of this practice, but it was mostly accepted. I mean, Aristotle himself was involved in pederasty. Plato himself, a lot of these elite Athens men would take on a young teenage boy as their kind of young lover and train them, and this was seen as something that was morally righteous by a lot of people. So is it okay? Does it make sense for us philosophically to go back and tell them that they were wrong? So that's what I want you to do today is, what's your perspective on this question? How do you see yourself in regards to the moral realism or relativism versus absolutism question? And moreover, why? What are the big assumptions behind your answer? So that's the assignment for today. I'd like you to post a reply or a private submission on Emoto. Hope you all are doing wonderful, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Take care, everybody.